Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our united progressive movement. Like we've been doing the past couple of weeks, we have been starting our new segment called The Daily Priority, in which we're trying to find out from guests like yourselves what your top three political priorities are so that we can hear what we as a collective need to be focusing on and how we best can address that. With me this week is Nicholas Pardi. Nick, welcome to the program.
Thanks, John.
Nick, do you want to let the Rosebuds out there know a little bit about yourself? I know we're going to be talking about universal basic income, ranked choice voting, and decriminalizing slash legalizing drugs, but want to let them know a little bit about who you are, what you do for work, and where you're from?
Yeah, absolutely. Like John said, I'm Nick. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. 19 in college at the moment for audio video production. That's basically my passion in life is documentaries, stuff like that. Uh, so I was pretty apolitical a couple of years ago. There was a brief point in my life where I was super like into politics, and then I realized, like, I was young, and I realized how ugly it is, and so I fell out of it. And then with this whole Andrew Yang campaign and the that grassroots movement, I became politically involved again, and now I have three priorities, which is awesome. You know what
Well,
I mean?
well, yeah, I strongly agree with you there. I myself started off pretty politically advocating in high school, especially on a local level. Then I got very cynical about politics in general, and I probably disengaged from like 2012 up until 2016. And I felt a little bit engaged from Bernie Sanders back in 2016, but then it took another level, as you kind of even indicated with Andrew Yang. I'm glad to have you on. And for those watching, I want them to be aware that we're going to be having a slight change in the format. Rather than having one big long episode, we're going to be breaking this up into bite-sized pieces for you all. So please make sure you check out all four parts on this so that you can hear Nick's thoughts on universal basic income, ranked choice voting, decriminalizing and legalizing drugs. And then finally, at the end, we're going to be doing some of your fan submitted questions, either on the subjects that we're covering today or a little bit beyond what we have on our current docket. So with that being said, Nick, I wanted to get to your first subject, universal basic income. How did this become one of your top priorities, and why do you think it's so necessary today that we look at this as a solution?
Yeah, so I actually found out about universal basic income about, I want to say, 4 years ago, maybe longer. It was about a YouTuber called Matthew Orfala. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but he's a big UBI advocate. And when I found out about it, I was frankly confused, and I wrote it off. Essentially, I was like, "Oh, that'll cause inflation. We'll never do that, right?" And then 4 years later, I see Andrew Yang on a podcast with Joe Rogan, and um, I watched the interview, and then rabbit hole, basically. I heard the UBI again, and I was like, wait a second, this is a term I've heard before, years past. So I actually emailed that YouTuber that I found out about UBI. I was like, hey, dude, like, have you, checked out Andrew Yang? Like, I think you should talk about him. And I think he got back to me, but he wasn't interested or something like that. But anyway, so yeah, it was a weird journey, sort of, the to making it my priority, one of my priorities. But now I believe we need it because our communities are not doing well. I see it firsthand. I live on the border of Ohio and Indiana, and it's a mess. There's, I don't, I want to be polite, but there's a lot of poverty, essentially, and with poverty, it becomes crime and whatnot. So I see it firsthand. I live kind of around some sketchy stuff, and I just think as a society, we shouldn't be letting the half of Americans be living paycheck to paycheck. I think we should have insurance basically for people for life events. Like, an emergency happens. I want somebody to be able to pay that emergency bill without going bankrupt, whatnot. And for me, that's like the main reason. There's a couple other reasons, but mainly it's for protecting our people of like from economic ruin, essentially.
Mm. Yeah, no, I hear you. I know of Matthew Orfman, as you had been alluding to. He actually, I think, is a pretty big Bernie Sanders supporter now. I
Yeah,
know I've seen some of
yeah,
his
definitely.
fan-made videos about it, so it's kind of interesting that that was your first exposure to universal basic income. And I also know that a ton of people kind of started taking this idea seriously after hearing it on the Joe Rogan Experience. So I think it's very interesting that you are one of those likely cases where Andrew Yang only became a reality for you when you saw him on that program. And that does speak to how powerful Rogan's platform really is. But I wanted to ask, I totally understand your explanation of wanting to address poverty that's kind of ravaging our country and how we're seeing this drain on so many of our local economies. But why do you think universal basic income among solutions for poverty is so unique to be able to do that?
Yeah, I think it's really unique because our current social safety nets just don't get the job done. You know, with all of these parameters that have to be followed, the no man in the household or whatnot or whatever, you know what I mean, right?
Hmm.
Like stipulations that cause people to lose out on benefits or whatnot, and then with the $15 minimum wage, some people have to take time off for emergencies. You you don't get that extra insurance. And I think UBI, why it's so powerful is because it lets the person decide what they can fix about their lives. It's not like we're giving you a credit to buy food or to buy, uh, you know, or any credit basically. Like it's just your money. You get to do what you want with it. What's going to make your life better? And I think that's why I'm so drawn to it. Is like I don't want uh, people in poverty um, to like okay, they have food vouchers, but they don't have the economic security to have a house or make rent. So I think the flexibility it gives people is one like huge. It's very big um, in terms of its superiority, uh, and yeah, I think people can get out of poverty. I think they just need a little bit of capital to get. They it's like I'm sorry. Maybe I ran off on a tangent, but
No,
yeah,
I think that
sorry.
makes sense. I think there's definitely an appeal to the unconditionality. I think one of the reasons why Andrew Yang's specific version of a universal basic income, the freedom dividend, I was skeptical at first when I used to be a Bernie Sanders supporter because I worried about its opt out of some of these means tested programs. But I agree from gaining more knowledge on that from a lot of the people who advocated for Yang, I saw how flawed our means tested system of welfare really is. And I agree that having that unconditionality to let people choose what really is going to make an impact on their lives has a lot of value. I know some of the critics would say, well, you gave the example of food and housing. Well, they would say, yes, we should provide both those things as well as all the basics of life. Why do you think that people should be making those choices for themselves rather than just having all of the agreed upon basics provided for?
Yeah, yeah. So you're saying, okay, UBI, they get UBI, they will spend it on housing, food. Why don't we just improve our housing and food programs?
Hmm.
Because personally, if I'm struggling, again, I want it, I want to be in control. I don't want, you know, it's the means testing. It it doesn't help with um, our lives variables. It's, life is unexpected things come in life, and they just the means testing systems we have do not allow for us to be flexible enough. Um, so I think UBI, it just gives it empowers people. It doesn't empower like I don't want this might be like mega libertarian or whatever, but I don't want to strengthen our government programs. I want to strengthen our people.
Mm.
So I think just giving economic resources to people empowers them, and I think, but giving people housing uh, vouchers, food vouchers, limits them to certain things that I don't think we should be limiting people to. Personally,
Yeah,
I think it should be in the people's hands, not through a middleman, essentially.
yeah. I mean, I largely can understand that approach. I think one of the struggles government has is, well, what do they consider the basics? For some people, that might be different than for others. For example, you're going to have the person who needs to make car payments because their car got totaled, and there's not a government program for cars specifically getting totaled, and they need that money. And I also agree that there's some level of trust we need to have with our government operating efficiently. For example, you may have the Bernie Sanders type of model take over for a period of time, but then it could swing back to another hands and the programs could be gutted. While something like a universal basic income, when you're given money, you still either have that money or you use that money already. It's
Yeah,
not like the program can just be stripped away from you and you have nothing afterwards. So I strongly agree with you there. I'm curious to know, one of the main reasons you said at first you weren't super sure about the idea was that it was going to cause inflation. Why did those concerns for you get alleviated over time, where you are not as concerned about that being a sticking point for not doing UBI?
yeah. So when that concern arose, I was very young. I was in high school, or maybe even middle school. Um, I assumed that the way it was funded was we would print money, which would most likely cause inflation if we did it like that. Um, and the reason that those concerns went away is because now I know how we are going to fund this UBI, at least in Andrew's plan, in terms of a VAT. Now, I think inflation isn't like written off. I think it could still inflate a little bit. I know in European countries with a VAT of 20%, they can see like a 10% increase in price on some products, because the companies are passing off the tax to the consumers. But here, the plan was 10% VAT. We might see a 5% increase in in the price of products, but because it's going to because it's paired with UBI, it's not just a VAT. The buying power of all these people will most likely bring those costs down because of increased demand, and then the like Amazon or whatnot increases supply, and eventually, because our economy is essentially like boosted and it's like going at a higher speed, whatnot, um, we could probably see prices eventually go down because of our economic power and spending power.
Hmm. I
Yeah, so I'm
certainly,
not concerned with it.
yeah, I can hear you on that economic stimulation, um, being able to increase our supply over time naturally and give people more productivity because simply, you know what, their lives are going to be improved, which allows them to be more productive too. I also think it's a very interesting point to bring up that and the way it's being paid for as a way to ease the concern of inflation. Mainly, I specifically like the idea of that because, as you mentioned, it does artificially make prices higher because you're going to have this tax on it. And so there's less room for a company to increase prices even higher above that because you have this already natural artificial increase that the government's imposed. So consumers are naturally already saying, hey, you already increased your prices because of this tax. Are we really going to bear even more of a price increase? Likely no.
Right.
And so I have also had that concern relatively alleviated as well. One use case that's frequently brought up when it comes to inflation is the subject of housing. You mentioned how there's all these people who are impoverished, who can't afford housing currently. I think the number is something around like 500,000 people are currently homeless. What would prevent inflation from occurring in the housing market? All these people now getting $1,000 every month, they're going to want to go rent a new apartment. That's going to increase demand. Landlords can therefore potentially increase prices. Why do you think that might not happen?
Well, I think there's a couple different um, sections of this problem in housing. Like in terms of people who are renting and they have say an apartment, 1,500 a month, let's say,
Hmm.
and they get okay. Now they have an extra 1,000 a month. I'm almost 100% sure it's illegal to raise rent based on income.
That
Correct
is
me if I'm wrong,
no, that's true.
but that's a protection we have right now. So in terms of landlords sticking it to current tenants, I don't see that happening because it is illegal. Now, with that being said, whenever there's a profit motive, people like to, get their greedy fingers around the in the loopholes and whatnot. But so I think in that sense, I'm not worried. With the increased demand of housing, because now more people are in that market, it's a it is a reasonable concern. I would say that. And I think we need to do other things as well to protect renters and buyers, essentially. So I'm not entirely sure on all of the landlord laws and whatnot, but if I'm a landlord, which I'm not, so this isn't a huge qualification, but um, I would expect to see more customers because now there's more economic resources in people's hands. I'm probably not going to jack up my prices because I want those customers. I don't want them to go to the duplex across town that's same amenities, whatnot, but it's a cheaper price. I think this is like a part of human-centered capitalism where because capitalism can run amok, we know this, but when the people have the power to essentially control the prices, like I think it's going to boost competition so much that we end up seeing it's going to be very competitive in terms of pricing. So I don't think all of the landlords are just going to go up and raise their prices by 50%, 100%. I think it will actually boost competition and maybe lower some prices
Yeah, I mean, I hear
over
you.
time.
Yeah, I totally hear you on the idea that it's not going to just be some coordinated market where all landlords come together and say, hey, we're all going to raise our prices 50% right now because we know they have all this money. No, they're going to compete with one another, which is going to drive it down. And then furthermore, it also helps people compete with not having to just rent property. It's the ability to get
Yeah.
property for themselves. So if you are getting screwed over by a landlord in terms of the rent prices, you can say, okay, I can go and try and get myself an actual piece of property to manage myself. Because we've had decreasing home ownership over time as well, mainly because we've had this huge divide in economic inequality. Most people can't afford to get housing currently. So I totally agree on that. And I also say you have all these people who are in current contracts with their landlords. It's not like that just gets ripped up. It's like you're still
Right.
under a
Yeah.
current lease. So that definitely
Yeah.
helps. And then finally, one of the things I always like to bring up is you have all these activism efforts to try and help bring down the housing costs. Like, for example, we are fighting the Airbnbs in the world of having excessive rental platforms that are temporary rentals rather than like long-term rentals. And so this doesn't come for free, this activism effort. It takes a lot of resources, and so having more resources into the community can fight for those activism efforts that can then help, in turn, drive these other initiatives that could lower housing. With that being said, given that this is one of my top priorities as well, I really am curious, Nick, in your opinion, what can be done on a government level to actually get this accomplished, as well as what can those that are watching currently do to help drive this activism going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm very excited to say, as you know, John, that um, we now have a plethora of congressional elections where one candidate is in support of UBI. So I think one thing that you can do, if you're out there listening and this is one of your priorities, is figure out what district you're in, your congressional district. Um, Look at the people running. There's a good amount from what I've seen. I've seen the list of congressional races with UBI kind of hanging above their heads, and one candidate is saying, "Hey, look, I'm in support of this," and they will, and generally um, they have a plan of this is how like it's beyond just the oh I endorse this idea. It's no, they actually have a universal basic income plan that they would like to put in front of the government. I so that's one step is see who you can elect. Uh, Another thing, so government. I think I'm not too sure about the. I'm not in government, so um, I'm not too sure what can be done governmentally besides electing a ton of people that support UBI. I also think we have a UBI caucus, which
Mm-hmm.
is a new term to me, which is fine. But because, like I said, I was politically disengaged, but there's a ton of events. There's I forget the organization, but
I'm guessing it might be the income movement that you're thinking of.
the income movement, yes, and they have marches. They have they're building a grassroots movement as well. Go to Scott Santon's pages. I mean, he's got tremendous resources and whatnot for you to explore. So I would just say get involved, really, essentially. Just get involved with
Yeah,
your
I, I,
local politics.
I strongly agree with that point. I'm involved in a lot of those organizations myself. Like the UBI caucus is a great way to help support the existing candidates that are out there. Income movement is specifically around UBI. And I totally agree we should be supporting some of these congressional races. But the one thing I wanted to add before we get into the next part is really don't be afraid to run yourself. Don't be afraid to try and take this on a local level too. You don't have to necessarily be someone running for federal Congress to enact it on a city level. Like you have Michael Tubbs from Stockton who did that in his own local community. There's been always those rumors that Andrew Yang might run for mayor of New York City.
Yeah.
So you don't have to just exclusively be running for Congress to try and bring universal basic income forward. But with that being said, I will see you all in the next part. We're going to be talking with Nick about ranked choice voting, so stick around and come check that out as well.